Hello everyone, in today's video we're going to continue our little bit on private pilot maneuvers with a few more. Again, I was going to do ground reference maneuvers, but I'll probably save that for next weekend. The other half of this, again, I'm thinking back to my days when I was trying to learn how to fly an airplane. Usually what would happen is after we did the ground reference maneuvers and the stalls and everything along those lines, we go ahead and move ourselves on to the landing sequence. There's basically three different types of landings we're going to be interested in. There's going to be everybody's favorite standard landing. There's going to be what they call the Crosswind Landing. And of course, there's going to be the no flap landing. Each one of those is pretty standard maneuvers, something that you're probably going to want to get yourself a little bit of familiarity with. So let's go ahead and take a look at our scenario. We're sitting here at beautiful Windham, Connecticut. There is a very, very fresh breeze coming directly from that direction. Now, the reason I picked Windham here is because we have a beautiful cross runway that we can utilize for this purpose, as well as a straight runway so that we can go ahead and fly that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pop back inside the plane, and we'll go ahead and set ourselves up for that initial landing. All right, the first one of the maneuvers we're going to take a look at today is going to be your standard landing. So I'm sitting here basically just kind of frozen, and you can see our handy-dandy runway sitting right there in the end. Now, a standard landing, the expectation is that you're supposed to be using the appropriate landing flaps. The keyword appropriate here, keep in mind that we have a 20-knot headwind right now, which is pretty substantial. Anything basically past 15 knots in the headwind category, you're probably looking at using 2 notches of flaps as opposed to the 3 that they normally would be landing with. When, of course, you're landing these planes, one thing you want to keep an eye on is going to be your approach speed. In this case, for a Cessna 172, you're looking for about 60 to 65 knots. For those of you who are taking a practical test, you have to keep this within 5 knots, which is a little harder than it sounds because, remember, in the real world, you have wind gusts that are constantly going to be buffeting the aircraft. This is something the simulator does just not quite get right. The wind in the real world is just like anybody who's sailed has had a very familiar experience with that. So before we touch down, a couple things we need to think about. Again, this is our standard landing. First of all, that we're using appropriate flaps. In this case, if there's no reason why we shouldn't use full flaps, maybe something's damaged or maybe the wind's too strong, we want to be using 100% of our flaps. We're going to confirm that our mixture's set correctly. We're going to make sure our speed is right around our approach speed. Now, each aircraft has unique approach speed. And keep in mind, as the aircraft gets lighter, the approach speed will progressively go low. If you're looking for a quick and dirty way to figure out the approach speed for any aircraft, you simply take the speed that you're going to be stalling at with the flaps all the way down, and you multiply it by 1.3. So in this case, 40 times 1.3 gets you an approach speed of 52 knots. Now, that's applicable if you are an airliner traveling at 140 knots with a very, very significant overage as far as flexibility and performance goes. Something this small, that's a little too slow. We can do it, it just doesn't mean you should do it. So again, for a particular standard landing, the most important thing here is to use the right flaps. Make sure we're flying into the wind as opposed to against the wind. And again, you don't have to do anything too aggressive to put it down on the ground. You've all seen about 1,000 landings, so I'm going to go ahead and unpause. I'm just put this thing gently on the ground. One thing I always tell people is when you're coming in for an approach for a landing is remember Gumpfels, that's gas undercarriage mixed to propeller flaps light speed. You want to confirm that your gas is set to the right tank. You're going to make sure your undercarriage is set, your mixture is set, your propeller is set, your flaps are set, your lights are set, and your speed is correct. Again, you want to keep that as close to your approach speed as possible. This is just your good old-fashioned standard landing. Coming in a little high here, but again, I prefer to run right into the number 27 as opposed to the big touchdown markers at the end. Once you get about 10 feet off the ground, go ahead and pull the throttle back. You're going to level yourself out. Wait until the plane starts to slow down. You're going to gently lift up the nose, and when you hear that beep, that means you're ready to touch the ground. Nice. All right, so that was the standard landing. And again, in the real world, the first 50 times you do that, you're probably going to use up about as much runway as I just did. Again, that was a pretty small landing. Now we're going to go ahead and do the same thing, but this time we're going to fly the crosswind version of that approach. All right, now we've gone ahead and mixed things up a teeny tiny bit here. We're at the same exact airport with the same exact wind conditions we had just a moment ago. Again, you can see kind of the end of the runway here. You can see our handy-dandy little crosswind runway. You'll notice, first of all, that our aircraft is not pointing in the direction of the end of the runway. The reason for this, of course, is the fact that you've got a very, very healthy wind coming out of this direction. And we can confirm that real quickly by looking at it here. Now, each aircraft has what they call a maximum demonstrated crosswind speed. You cannot safely land the aircraft past that speed with a significant crosswind factor. So for this particular aircraft, it happens to be 15 knots, so the wind happens to be 11 knots. So we are about 66% into our maximum demonstrated crosswind speed. So when you demonstrate and when you're doing your private pilot's license, the actual crosswind landing, they're going to do the same thing I have here. They're literally going to land, come around, and then just pick another runway to basically land at. not. The trick to this, of course, is you want to make sure you crab the plane. Again, use your feet for this to go ahead and stick the nose in a direction so that your ground track is nice and even all the way down onto the ground. As you're approaching the ground, of course, remember you're always going to have to make some adjustments because the wind gets weaker and shifts in direction as you get lower to the ground. Again, this is something you're going to deal with in the real world, more so than in a simulator, but again. Another pro tip, too, is remember to think about your flaps here. I've got my flaps pushed all the way down, which is going to make any sort of bits of turbulence have a much more massive impact on the actual landing itself. The trick here, by the way, is that we're going to continue crabbing like this, and then when we go to land the aircraft, we're going to try to kind of catch this tire and then kind of roll onto the side. Again, depending on just how gusty Microsoft is going to make this, this could be a little bumpy, but all crosswind landings typically are. All right, let's do it. All right, again, keep your speed correct. Some people actually come a little tiny bit faster when you're going to be doing one of these landings. I'm going to slow down just a tiny bit here, make sure everything looks okay there. Looks good. All right, again, keep right around your approach speed. You can always add a few knots in order to take out the effect of the wind a little bit. But remember, if you start adding speed to the aircraft, you're going to cause your landing roll to increase proportionately. I'm actually at a pretty good angle here. I'm actually going to pull the throttle all the way back. You can see that windsock is looking right at me. There we go. I'm just going to kind of coast it all the way down to the number 36. And again, this is just a simple crosswind, so I've got my nose. We're going to do our normal leveling out maneuver, and we're going to try to catch that back left tire first. And we're just going to roll the plane onto the ground softly. As soon as you do get onto the ground, you want to go ahead and make sure your controls are deflected into the wind so it does not tumble us. Gentle on the brakes. Remember, one side of the plane will brake a little bit smoother than the other side of the plane. And also expect to need a lot more runway than you usually do. So that's the next requirement. Now, the final requirement is a little bit different. All right, our third and final variant of landing we're going to take a look at is what they call the no-flap landing. Now, this is one of those that's not usually an actual requirement, but it's still something you probably want to be comfortable with in case the person inspecting you likes to make your life interesting. One of the toughest parts about a no-flap landing is the fact that your airspeed is going to be a bit high. The reason for this, of course, is we have drastically less drag when we're landing without our flaps versus when we're landing with our flaps. The other problem you're going to have, and this is very interesting, is because our flaps do not shift our... Whoa! I guess I forgot to put those up. Sigh. I almost got away with it. So since our flaps are in the up position, the aircraft is going to be pitched up significantly more. Now, there's a couple different strategies we can utilize here in order to kind of minimize the difficulty we're going to have with this. The first method you've all seen in the past is flying a slip, where basically you're going to slide the plane sideways in a way to try to reduce the energy of the plane. Now, for whatever reason, in this version of Flight Simulator, I swear the aircraft have so much less drag than their real-world equivalents. It's usually super effective, but this makes it difficult. So we're going to have to think about those two elements. And the trick that I always like to use here, too, is remember, once the aircraft gets slow, it's going to want to stay slow. So, of course, we'll go ahead and unpause things here. I'm going to go ahead and shift the plane almost instantaneously. Again, I'll fly a little bit of a slip here. I'm just trying to suck energy out of the plane. Now, when you actually demonstrate a flapless landing, one of the cool tricks that I've learned from talking to enough people is to actually use your flaps on the approach and then remove them when it's time to actually land the plane. I find that a little on the cheap side, but it is a surprisingly effective strategy. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pull the slip out of the aircraft. So now you'll notice I am basically gliding this in. Now you can see just by looking out the window just how high up the nose has to stay here in order for me to basically maintain the situation. I'm actually basically dumping the trim. You can't see this, but this thing is getting cranked right now, trying to give myself a little bit of trim. Now the trick here is to do the best you can to stay on the back of the power curve. What do I mean by that? I mean that stay a little slow, forcing your nose to go up a little high. When you do this, you actually increase the amount of drag the aircraft produces. If you overdo it, of course, you're going to find yourself stalling. But if you underdo it, you're going to find yourself unable to see the end of the run, or I should say, quite the opposite. You'll be going way too fast. I'm just going to sit here, and now that I've kind of created a lot of drag with the aircraft, I'm just going to kind of gently let it kind of work down. Again, my flaps are up. We made sure we're not cheating anymore. And you can see that because I'm slow now, the aircraft wants to stay slow. You want to try to stay on that side. Remember, because you don't have that extra drag, your engine is going to be very responsive to thrust changes. Actually, you know what I mean. Your thrust is going to be responsive to engine changes. There we go. We got it. Again, I'm just kind of using my little graphical display here to help keep me nice and lined up. Remember that really nasty wind we had earlier is still present. Okay, flaps are up. We're going to do our usual test. Come full, gas undercarriage mixture for flap side speed. Obviously, flaps are up. So the big weird thing about a flapless landing is the aircraft, when you go to hit the brakes, don't be surprised if it pitches on you funny because it's not going to be what you're used to. Again, I'm just going to put the big old number on the front of the screen right above my hand of my dashboard, and I'm just going to basically milk the throttle. The wind today, like I said, is extremely gusty. So it's going to make things a little bit tricky here. All right, 27, we're a little low. We don't want to land before the runway. Okay, now when you kill the power, this thing is going to stop flying. So I'm going to kill the power. And as soon as the propeller slows down, it's just going to be like, I'm done. And lift that nose up. Look at how high you have to keep the nose in order to actually land. Now that I've landed, I can actually hold the nose up a teeny tiny bit to basically give me a little bit of aero braking. You know, if you were a jet, this would be much simpler. Now I'm going to gently apply the brakes until that front wheel comes down. Remember, I don't have that extra drag. And we are down. Nice. All right, hopefully this video is helpful. Again, next time we'll take a look at ground reference maneuvers, which is going to be, that's going to be a project in a flight simulator. If you don't do that one in VR, it's going to be a lot harder. Or if you have head tracking, it's not going to be as bad. Other than that, enjoy.